When an artificial intelligence turned its gaze to the most famous stone text of antiquity, researchers saw what had eluded the human eye for generations, and this called into question what had long been regarded as immutable knowledge about ancient Egypt. On a surface once thought exhausted for further reading, the faintest strokes and barely perceptible cuts emerged, revealing nuances of meaning previously unnoticed, even by the most experienced observers. Beneath layers of loss and damage, traces of edits and deliberate omissions were revealed, altering the usual course of interpretation and forcing a reconsideration of what had been thought read once and for all. What became visible in the body of the Rosetta Stone undermined confidence in the supposedly long-completed work and in the illusion of a definitive translation. For more than 2 centuries, the stone slab had stood behind glass as a symbol of the triumph of textbooks described it as the milestone after which humanity had unlocked the code of hieroglyphs. And that episode was presented as a single, completed victory, frozen in the dark rock. The public left convinced the mystery had apparently been solved in 1822 and sealed by one breakthrough and one name. The sense of completion became part of the myth surrounding the artifact itself. Yet the first wave of elation concealed an awkward truth. The early readings were not final proofs, but carefully weighed compromises. Scholars worked with worn-away sections, fragments of lines, and assumptions borrowed from Greek grammar to fill the gaps. As a result, a working understanding of the text, the stone spoke only enough to convince the world of its comprehensibility, after which questions were treated as closed. Over time, confidence hardened into dogma. Museums labeled the inscription as definitively deciphered, and academic interest shifted to other subjects. The Rosetta Stone ceased to be the object of active research and became a monument, as if it had fulfilled its mission. Only a few specialists allowed themselves to doubt, and their doubts concerned the translation. In the Greek text, some turns of phrase looked oddly repetitive, while in the Egyptian sections, no flawless equivalent could be found, which in itself raised questions. It was precisely such subtle honorific titles took on a different hue when moving from one script to another, as if the voice reading the same line suddenly changed its intonation. Religious references appeared compressed and abbreviated, as if longer, more detailed formulas had been condensed into a very compact form. These discrepancies were noted in footnotes, but were most often attributed to the translator's stylistic quirks rather than treated as warning signs. The main thing that the general public was rarely told was how heavily the original decipherment relied almost exclusively on the Greek portion of the text. The hieroglyphic corpus was fitted to the Greek sense. Hieroglyphs were read through the prism of an already known translation, taken as independent testimony. In the 19th century, such an approach was understandable and explicable, but it was precisely this approach that locked the translation into a self-sustaining loop. Any discrepancy was smoothed over to preserve the apparent course. The stone's power, its physical grandeur, served as a cover for the fragility of its inscriptions. The surface bore traces of secondary use, damage from transport, and centuries of erosion. Lines broke off mid-word, signs wore away and turned into indistinguishable roughness. Voids were filled with educated guesses, and whole interpretations were then built on those guesses, which over time lost their provisional, hypothetical character. Footnotes faded, becoming the gray background of scholarship. Caveats disappeared from public explanations. The translation hardened, ceasing to resemble a flexible scholarly conclusion and becoming a rule. People stopped feeling it necessary to question it. It seemed unnecessary and even obstructive. After all, if the hieroglyphs could supposedly be read, what more could be drawn from them? The answer came not so much from Egyptology itself, as from a change in attitude towards sources and methods of working with them. When other ancient texts began to be rethought with new tools, patterns of omission emerged. Marginal signs, differences in carving depth. The Rosetta Stone, hitherto considered fully read, began to be seen not as a finished manifesto, but as an early redaction. Curators quietly approved new scans. Researchers compared old impressions with the present state of the surface. Digital overlays showed that the translated lines did not always precisely match the actual intervals of the carving. The sense looked compressed, simplified, smoothed. The stone may have been read, but it had not been listened to in full. The realization did not arrive to applause, but as a subtle, barely perceptible unease. The confidence that had taken hold suddenly cast doubt on what many had considered finally deciphered. The thought hung in the air. Might the world's most famous decipherment rest on guesses and assumptions that no one had bothered to recheck? The illusion of wholeness cracked, not because the stone itself had changed, but because the patient lens of those who studied it had changed. Researchers stopped seeing the Rosetta Stone only as a solved problem and began to perceive it as an evolving process. They stopped asking only, "What does it mean?" and started asking other questions. How the inscription is structured, how it was edited, what the boundaries of the very material basis of the text were. Attention shifted from pure interpretation to the evidence, from the search for meaning to the study of the mechanics of its emergence. Every scratch, every hesitating interval, every line break ceased to be annoying defects and became meaningful data. The stone began to be read not only by its words, but by the decisions left on its surface, by the choice of a sign's form, the manner of incision, the traces of corrections. A disturbing possibility emerged. Clarity was taken for completeness, and the final meaning was formed as much from the surviving fragments. For generations, scholars thought they heard the stone's whole voice. But the opening of doubt forced a different question. What exactly had they truly been hearing all those years? Doubt led to the most obvious thing, the condition of the slab itself. The conversation was no longer about glory or the precision of translation, but about the physics and history of the damage. When the modern world first encountered the Rosetta Stone, it was already broken. From the moment it was discovered in 1799, the slab was not intact. It appeared with wounds that invisibly steered scholars. The upper part was entirely missing. When exactly it disappeared is unknown. The absence of that fragment is beyond doubt. The hieroglyphic portion of the text begins with an obvious break in thought, as if the introduction had been erased long before the excavations. That loss apparently contained a formal framework, a key that set the rules for reading all the following lines. Across the lower surface of the slab ran diagonal cracks. They were not superficial scratches. The cracks cut through signs, ripped words apart, and destroyed grammatical ties. Early translators had to supply endings, bridge connections between severed phrases, and retreat from an imagined continuity to places where no evidence of such continuity existed. Each fracture became a point of choice, hidden under a mask of confidence. The stone's edges tell the same story, but do so hesitantly and with reservations. The margins are flattened and abraded. The slab was once part of the text had been consciously sacrificed for the sake of fitting. That is, fragments were simply cut away to ease compatibility with other pieces. Titles, dates, and ritual specifications were likely removed without hesitation, not considered necessary to preserve in full. The Greek section is better preserved and suffered less, while the hieroglyphic and demotic fragments incurred more significant losses. This imbalance subtly tipped the scales in favor of the Greek text. Commentators began to lean more heavily on the Greek lines, assuming they were identical to the other versions, instead of verifying correspondences piece by piece. Damage to the stone directed reading and interpretation. Signs that had once differed by a single stroke were now often indistinguishable. Determinatives and keys of the Egyptian writing system dissolved into the general tone of the surface and lost their function as guides. What might have looked like repetition often concealed a loss of nuance. What seemed like simplicity of writing was frequently the result of abrasion. Even the color of the stone worked against clarity. Dark rock absorbs light and masks fine incisions unless the angle of illumination is perfectly caught. 19th century scholars used candles, made ink rubbings, and took plaster casts. These methods reliably fixed contours, but leveled depth and relief. The hierarchy of carving, where a strike was stronger and where a stroke was secondary, was lost and transferred to paper or plaster. The more voids appeared, the stronger the temptation to restore symmetry artificially. Missing elements were replaced with structure and formulaic turns to fill the gaps. Over time, restorations froze and came to be perceived as canon, and broken parts ceased to be regarded as problems, dissolving into the habitual background. No one then could fully assess the scale of the accumulated losses. A missed line here, a trimmed edge there, an ignored determinative, each alone is trivial, but together they amount to changes of enormous magnitude. The stone did not lie. It was incomplete, and its smoothed incompleteness produced confidence in scholars, where caution was required. Modern researchers propose treating absence itself as an important fact for interpretation. Blank spaces in the text suddenly ceased to be empty. Particular attention was paid to fragments where gaps repeated identically across different lists and copies. They noticed areas where cracks coincided with shifts in the author's tone, and zones where erasure neighbored religious or administrative vocabulary. Where the stone crumbled, the carved sign lost its force and meaning. If losses carried with them sequences that had previously gone unnoticed, it became clear they could no longer be ignored. At that point, light became an instrument of evidence. When it was recognized that the absence of information itself pointed the way for inquiry, everything became clearer. A single observer's eye could no longer provide a complete answer. The Rosetta Stone was pushed to the limits of the methods by which it had traditionally been observed. What had survived beneath the layer of erosion and the mesh of cracks would not emerge on its own. It had to be extracted from the dark, made visible artificially. The solution came from the science of visualization. The stone was no longer only read, it was scanned. High-precision surface maps recorded millions of depth points, allowing differences smaller than a grain of sand to be detected. What had appeared as a flat plane to the naked eye, in these data revealed ridges, depressions, and traces of tool pressure. Redirected oblique lighting changed the course of things. At extreme angles of incidence, micro-shadows emerged in the scarred marks. Lines that had been considered erased came through as translucent contours. These were no longer guesses. They were physical remnants of carving, sufficient for measurements. Infrared wavelengths went even further. Individual wavelengths penetrated the darkened film left by centuries of touch and oxidation. Under the stains, incisions that had previously been hidden from view appeared. Some signs turned out to be longer than previously assumed. In others, directed cuts were revealed that could change the order of reading. Time did not simplify the text, it hid it deeper. Three-dimensional modeling turned the stone surface into a landscape through which one could virtually move without physical contact. Researchers rotated the plane, enlarged fragments, and isolated individual strokes. A pressure map showed where the blow was stronger, where a line had been added later, where the chisel had slid with greater flourish. The writing ceased to be abstract information and once again took on the substance of craftsmanship. And remarkably, the damages themselves began to tell their story. Where the surface had been intentionally leveled, the imprint of the tool differed noticeably from accidental chips. These were not natural cracks, but traces of deliberate intervention in the material. Individual lines, as if muted, had been sanded down so that their legibility was impaired, but not entirely erased. The lighting also revealed a layout error. Some signs were slightly shifted relative to the expected alignment. At a glance, this meant nothing, but in digital reconstruction, such deviations were perceived as adaptation, a deliberate accommodation. The craftsman changed the spacing during the carving process itself, adjusting the distances between signs and lines, likely to accommodate changes in content. The decree ceased to look like an unchanging final document. It revealed itself as a text that was formed and transformed in the course. In several places deeper, final cuts overlapped barely noticeable early incisions. This was not poor workmanship. These were corrections in the literal sense of the word. Now it was clear. The stone preserved not a single final version of meaning, but the traces of negotiation, correction, and editorial control over the text. Light did more than illuminate the surface. It revealed the principles that guided the creation of the inscription. The logical conclusion suggested itself. If individual parts of the text had been altered during the carving, then the final formulations represented choices, and choice always implies intent. The stone conveys not only rules, it affects the reader's perception with its relief. For a long time, this object was read as a translation problem. People searched for meaning in the words. In fact, the researchers faced a typesetting and design problem. Meaning was contained not only in the vocabulary, but in the depth of the cut, the force of the strike, the spacing, and the silences hidden beneath the surface. But simply detecting these traces was not enough. They had to be learned from the noise produced at a scale beyond human intuition and conscious perception. Raking light revealed what had survived and what had been lost. To understand meant recognizing pattern in an excess of detail, seeing structure amid a multitude of small differences. Scanning uncovered new volumes of information, but knowledge ran up against its own complexity. Millions of depth measurements, shadows, and fragmented strokes occupied the same relief space. A person could study individual fragments, but it proved impossible to hold the entire aggregate of data in the mind at once. Operating on meaning based only on intuition was no longer feasible. The turning point came when computers were no longer tasked merely with translating words and were trained to recognize forms. Machine models stopped working with abstract values and concentrated on concrete outlines, the curvature of lines, the depth of incisions, the distribution of force during carving, and the relative intervals between elements. The algorithm recorded details the human eye usually does not notice or track consistently. Unlike a human, the system did not start from an assumption of what a sign ought to be. It measured what was actually present on the medium. Incomplete, barely visible traces were not discarded but were assigned probabilistic scores. Overlapping cuts were separated into layers, and distortions caused by damage were computationally unspooled, bringing the image closer to its original contours. The main problem remained ambiguity. Egyptian writing often allows signs to merge, overlap, and be compressed for the sake of composition, and humans usually resolve such cases based on contextual experience. The machine addressed this by scale. Comparing thousands of known forms, it computed the most suitable configuration to fill a damaged area, while not imposing a single variant where no unity might have existed. As the algorithm learned, it began to register what had previously escaped specialists' attention. Elements considered purely decorative turned out to be grammatical markers, signs that at first glance seemed repetitive, decomposed into different constructions, eroded down. The machine did not smooth over historical traces. It argued with them, bringing contradictions to light. Importantly, the algorithm did not place the Greek text in a privileged position. Each section was treated as an independent layer of information, and synchronization between them occurred at a later. This disrupted the previous feedback loop. When the hieroglyphic structure diverged from the Greek phrasing, it was not smoothed over, but recorded. As a result, patterns emerged that a single person could not have traced. Sign frequencies changed from section to section. Certain titles clustered where the surface had been deliberately altered, and religious terminology revealed structural complexity not fully conveyed in the Greek rendition. The decree ceased to look like a simple mirror translation. It revealed itself as a multi-layered message addressed to different audiences. The ghostly undercuts became even clearer, as if earlier half-shadows had finally acquired contours. The algorithm exposed lower, hidden layers of carving and neatly arranged them into sequences that began to carry meaning. These no longer seemed like incoherent sketches. Variants of wording unfolded before us, often stricter and sharper than the final text. What was later softened or removed altogether manifested as deliberate self-restraint, deserving attention no less than what was retained. It was no less surprising that the system found nothing where customary tradition would confidently have filled in titles and forms of address. Some royal titles were absent. Ritual formulas were likewise abbreviated, even though precedent demanded the full customary versions. Such a coincidence could not be explained as random. It resembled negotiations, concessions, compromises, and calculated omissions. The document did not read like a pompous proclamation. It presented itself as a carefully constructed text in which power manifested through economy of words rather than their abundance. Yet even the best classification system ran up against natural limits. The stone had still been damaged, and whole phrases were lost forever. Algorithms alone were insufficient for their reconstruction. Comparison was needed. If one artifact cannot say everything, then where else might the lost fragments of its words be preserved? The answer proved both simple and radical. The Rosetta Stone was not created as a unique, exceptional specimen. It was one of many copies distributed across Egypt, in temples, on public squares, and in administrative centers. What had once been regarded as secondary and incidental suddenly acquired decisive significance. For decades, archaeologists had entered parallel inscriptions into catalogs and index cards. These texts lay scattered across different regions, fragmentary in nature and exposed to time and weathering. In places, they were used to writing them off as mere duplication, but repetition, if read correctly, provided the key to the puzzle. Each local version preserved what another had lost, and together they filled one another's gaps. Researchers assembled a digital corpus of copies of the same decree from distant places and began to compare them. In some spots, they cut into limestone, in others into sandstone. Local workshop hands changed spacing, depth of cut, and the algorithms were fed not translations but visual and structural information, and fragments from one location lined up beside missing sections from another, filling historical blanks. Where the relief on the Rosetta Stone broke off mid-phrase, and where a temple wall miles away continued the thought, there arose the sense of an unfinished dialogue between center and province. Scribal habits adopted in different regions proved decisive for how the text reached people. In some lands, manuscripts unfolded religious terms in full detail, so the listener would grasp theological subtleties. In other places, the priority was political formulas that firmly fixed power and order. This could not be dismissed as accidental carelessness. Rather, it was a precise tuning of content to the local audience. Every device and every deviation was a deliberate emphasis chosen to reinforce the intended line of meaning. Omissions unexpectedly played an important role as well. In some copies, entire blocks present in neighboring variants were missing. When these gaps were mapped, a clear pattern emerged from the chaos. Where the priesthood was stronger, theological formulations were retained. Where royal power held more sway, religious fragments were compressed and simplified. The decree clearly adapted to local balances of power. Differences in wording also revealed priorities. The set of hieroglyphs changed from place to place, showing which concepts were considered inviolable and which were open to trade, and texts about divine legitimacy changed little, whereas formulas about taxes and obligations fluctuated most. The inscription material mattered too. Softer stone allowed deeper incisions and thus preserved markers of stress and pause that were lost on the Rosetta slab. This was not a decorative detail. Such techniques served as a guide to pronunciation, where to pause, where to heighten intonation, how to shape the ritual rhythm. The decree was designed as a sounding text, not merely a visual memento. As the fragments were put together, the architecture of the original message emerged. Paragraph divisions, recurring framing formulas, and a rhetorical arc that carried the listener from reverent perception to a sense of duty. The London Stone had smoothed that composition, and the network of provincial copies helped restore it. The most illustrative sections, absent from the Rosetta Stone, survived only in provincial variants. These lines dispelled the burden of ambiguity and, without excessive pomp, clearly listed expectations, privileges, and consequences. As a result, the decree ceased to appear purely symbolic and emerged as a practical instrument of governance, cloaked in religious celebration. Copies did not dilute the meaning of the document. On the contrary, they sharpened it. Restoration studies led researchers to a clear revelation about the nature of the text. The Rosetta Stone appears not as a universal master key, but as a damaged header of a far wider communication system. Meaning is not concentrated in a single artifact. It lives and manifests itself in the interrelations of the many elements of that system. When the reconstruction of the text was completed, for the first time in more than 2,000 years, and then it became clear. Before us was not merely carved praise or faceless glorification, but a carefully constructed strategy, hidden beneath a veil of piety. Once the document's entire structural scheme was revealed, The semantic emphasis shifted, if only subtly, but enough to alter the perception of the text. It became clear that the document was constructed not for commemorative celebration, but with a practical aim: to stabilize power during a vulnerable period. The restored introduction proved to be more than a formal hymn. It legitimized power through direct alignment with the divine order, and thereby linked royal authority to the cult institutions whose honor and influence. This was not a metaphorical expression of respect, but a finely calibrated bargain. The monarch is proclaimed chosen, but his right is conditional. Power is granted only to the extent that the sacred order is maintained and not violated. Next, the demonstration of generosity comes to the fore as a tool of governance. Lists of tax exemptions, debt cancellations, and temple donations are set out with meticulous, factual detail, reminiscent of an accounting entry. At first glance, such generosity looks like clemency, but in context, it is a precise political calculation. Each act of favor is addressed to those institutions that, otherwise, could become hotbeds of discontent and serve as source. The priesthood thereby receives a special position. Its privileges are codified, its status confirmed, and its role on the public stage elevated. In return, the priesthood is expected to perform rituals that daily renew the image of royal favor. This is by no means a simple profession of faith, but a means of communication between the authorities and society. The ritual becomes a repeated mechanism of reinforcement, resonating in those places where discord might arise. One reconstructed passage made the political urgency of the message particularly clear. The decree does not explicitly name the causes of the disturbances, but it indirectly points to them. Crop failures, administrative breakdowns, or challenges to authority are reframed in the language of cosmic imbalance. There is no explicit accusatory charge against any particular individual, but it is made clear that order is fragile and requires immediate restoration. What follows are measures of coercion framed in a softened, pious form. Violation of the regulations is not called treason against the state. It is presented as an offense against the gods. Thanks to this approach, individual political responsibility is shifted from the plane of direct accusation into the moral sphere. Resistance thus becomes sacrilege. Obedience through piety is not merely a verbal slogan, but a deliberate technique of governance. Decrees do not operate as direct orders to each individual, but indirectly. Authority and temples become centers of loyalty. Priests, addressing congregations, turn the texts into a justification of authority. The state intentionally transfers part of the belief system to external structures, thereby retaining control while making its power invisible and resilient. Different regions did not receive identical texts, but variants adapted to local circumstances. Where resistance was expected, wording was expanded with promises and concessions. Where control was firm, the rhetoric, conversely, was tight. At first glance, this inconsistency appears secretive and haphazard, but in practice it is a flexible strategy, masked as customary tradition. What many thought to be mere ceremonial repetition turned out to be a deliberate method of reinforcing power. Key ideas are not. The text was meant not merely to be read, but to settle into the ear and habits, to become a natural part of everyday perception. This is governance through habituation, through repetition, forming consent with. Even the choice to combine several writing systems in one document had a practical, not decorative, purpose. It was not about calligraphic beauty, but about targeted segmentation of the audience. Everyone received their own address code. Greek for administrators. When one begins to distinguish what was softened, what was omitted, or intentionally rephrased, the decree loses the appearance of a neutral text. It appears as a mirror of the ruler, willing to bargain for their own survival. Power in such a case is not simply proclaimed. It is constructed, wrapped in reverence, and spread through ritual obligations. The Rosetta Stone has long been celebrated for having unlocked the language, but far less often seen as a document of control. After the text was fully reconstructed, its purpose became obvious. It was not a passive record of rule, but an active instrument linking faith, economy, and power into a single mechanism. And the changes did not stop there. Having been made whole, the stone acquired a second life. It ceased to be merely an object that had been deciphered and became a test of history's capacity to change under the influence of a new form of intelligence. For the first time, antiquity was not only studied with machines, for the first time it was studied by machines themselves. This is not a matter of fine wording. Algorithms did not inherit academic conventions. They are alien to reverence for established formulations. They treat evidence as it is presented, and as they have been taught to recognize it. As a result, the invisible layer of inertia that for decades had quietly steered interpretations, decrees that had been regarded as uniform, revealed signs of intentional variability. Standard translations turned out to be coordinated versions, and historical narratives that had seemed smooth and complete began to fray at the edges of their former outlines. What alarmed scholars more was not simply the presence of errors, but how long those errors had remained unquestioned. The Rosetta Stone had long served as a baseline, a support for understanding language and for administrative decisions. If its interpretation is fluid, then revisions affect hundreds of dependent readings and interpretations. Museums faced a new demand for integrity. Inscriptions and labels, once written in a confident tone, educational materials lagged behind the updated findings. The authority of the museum display increasingly diverged from the authority of the evidence. Institutions accustomed to preserving certainty as a value were forced to acknowledge the mutability of conclusions. Erosions, mounts, and fragments gained the status of parts of the object's biography. Each stage of its existence carries information, from ancient corrections to traces of modern touches. It is in this way that the very notion of a single correct past is called into question. History now appears not as one coherent version, but as an iterative process in which versions replace and complement one another. The capacity to hear, that is, to perceive and interpret traces of the past, has shifted as well. The dissemination of this discourse beyond strictly scientific circles proved inevitable. Artificial intelligence demonstrated an ability to detect patterns outside a preordained narrative. That does not make it impartial, but it lends its conclusions an unsettling force. Old interpretations can no longer rely on authority alone. They must undergo a renewed, broad, and thorough re-examination. From all this emerges a profound philosophical turn in how we understand the past and our interaction with it. If we try to reconstruct meaning by distancing ourselves from involvement, belief, and cultural reflexes, historical truth ceases to be merely a consensus and increasingly appears as the convergence of independent lines of evidence. Traditional narratives begin to give way to intersections of data, and customary authorities to careful fact-checking. The Rosetta Stone has ceased to be merely a linguistic key. It has become a vivid demonstration of a principle, an illustration of how different sources converge on a single point of understanding. The past is not static, and our knowledge of it is limited by the questions we know how to ask. So new questions open up new meanings. Machines have expanded our ability to pose such questions and to systematize the answers. They have not replaced human insight. This expansion simultaneously offers opportunities and imposes obligations. Reinterpretation can shed light, but it can also unsettle established narratives. It is these narratives, the stories on which identities, power, and collective memory rest, that can be significantly altered under the pressure of new interpretations. The stone's second life does not promise simple consolation or the preservation of the old order. It offers the possibility of correcting past mistakes and refining understanding. The novelty of the moment lies not only in the tools, but in time itself. For centuries, history was shaped against a backdrop of scarcity, rare access to artifacts, narrow methodologies, and limited perspectives. That period now seems to be drawing to a close, and the Rosetta Stone has become a threshold through which new conversations are opening. Remaining behind glass and outwardly unchanged, it embodies not an ending, but an invitation to dialogue. Even the most studied objects can speak again if approached without imposed expectations. Today, this stone belongs no longer only to the era of its creation, nor only to the century of its decipherment. It takes part in the ongoing conversation between fact and reason, between human and machine, between past and present. If a single artifact is capable of such a revival, The question ceases to be about that one object and becomes a question of how deeply we are prepared to re-listen to history when we acquire a new way of listening.